Hi, everyone. Dr. Joni Johnston. Welcome to Unmasking a Murder. I'm a forensic psychologist, private investigator, and your host for our show. I know many of you have heard already, or I'm assuming that you have, that Rex Heuermann, the alleged Long Island serial killer, or at least one of them, has been charged with a fourth murder this week. I'm going to just briefly review the case very, very briefly, because there are some amazing videos out there, which I'll link in the description, that go into a lot more detail than I'm going to about the actual case. What I want to focus on today are the most recent findings, and also, and even more importantly, as a psychologist, some of the psychology that we might expect behind some of these murders. So just to kind of briefly recap, last summer in June of 2023, Rex Heuermann, who was 59 at the time, professional architect, who was married with two children, no criminal history, was arrested and charged with the murders of three young women: Megan Waterman, Amberlynn Costello, and Melissa Bartholomew. Last week, he was also charged with the murder of Maureen brainard-barnes. These women were all in their early to mid-20s. They were working as sex workers at the time of their murder. And they were called the Gilgo Beach Four because they were found in relatively similar locations and kind of wrapped similarly. So even though 10 bodies have been found, we don't know to date if the same person is responsible. Just the fact that these four are so similar and the way they were found was so consistent, they were kind of lumped together and were assumed, I think, from the very beginning, that the suspect or the murderer was the same person, that they were killed by the same person. The reason that Heurmann was not charged initially with the fourth murder of Maureen brainard-barnes was because they were waiting on some DNA results. Even when he was arrested, it seemed as if the prosecutors had quite a bit of evidence against him, including some mitochondrial DNA evidence. Mitochondrial DNA evidence is strong, but it's not overpowering, meaning that, yes, it runs in families. Yes, you can make some pretty good assumptions. It does narrow things down, but it doesn't exclude a lot of people. And therefore, the defense had already made some statements about the fact that there are literally thousands of people living in the US who might share similar mitochondrial DNA. They were very dismissive of it. This past week, what came out, number one, was that they have been able to extract some nuclear DNA, which has much more genetic material and is much more specific in terms of identifying one single individual. As a matter of fact, if I'm not a math whiz, never have been, but my head was spinning listening to the press conference talking about the long line of zeros that would go after, the number, in estimating how likely it was that the person whose DNA was found at the crime scene was not Rex Heuermann, or also his wife and his daughter. Their DNA was also found, which they believe was probably transfer DNA. At this point, there was never been any evidence that Victoria, his daughter, had anything to do with this. And there's never been any evidence that we know of that his wife, Asa Ellerup, has anything to do with it as well. So much, much stronger DNA evidence, apparently. A couple of other things came out. One, as a psychologist, was of particular interest to me. One of the most disturbing things that came out last summer was the content of some of the searches he was doing. A lot of them involved either interest in children, or they involved a lot of very, very disturbing torture porn requests and searches. It was really even hard to read. And what was disturbing, I think, this time around, one was, again, just not just the extent of it, but just the subject matter of these searches. And I'm not going to go into a lot of them just because they're disgusting. They're just terrible. And you can go and read the bail arraignment as well and read them for yourself if you're interested in doing that. But just suffice to say that he had a wide range of deviant sexual interest in terms of the ages he was interested in and in terms of the kinds of pornography that he wanted to see. And that, of course, is very disturbing. And what is also disturbing about this is that even in 2023, last year, before he was arrested, he was not only engaging in these searches, he was also apparently texting and communicating with sex workers. One of the things that has challenged researchers, I think, for a long time, and law enforcement as well, is this question of, if somebody's a serial killer, do they stop on their own? And for a long time, we thought, no, they didn't, unless they were dead or they were in prison. Those are the only reasons that they would stop because this urge or compulsion was just too strong. Well, we know that's not true. There have been serial killers who've taken 10-year breaks or longer than that. They were out in the community, and there's no indication that they committed any further, violent sexual offenses. What's concerning, though, is that some of the activities that led to other murders or led to the murders that we're talking about not only happened before these murders, which happened between 2007 and 2010, but have continued up until 2023. And it seems very concerning to me to think that somebody would stop acting out their apparently, very, very deviant sexual fantasies and yet at the same time continue to consume this kind of pornographic material and continue to solicit and talk to sex workers, which was the way that he lured them, his victims, to begin with. So I'm not familiar. If you are, please let me know. I'm not familiar of a serial killer, or certainly a sexually motivated serial killer, who has stopped killing and yet continued all the other activities they were doing ahead of time. So if you have more information than I do, I would love to hear that. So that was very concerning to me. And I think it does raise the question, which has been buzzing around since he was arrested back in June. Are there other victims out there? I feel good that law enforcement, I think, will do a huge effort to try to answer that question. And hopefully the answer is no, but we'll see. So now we've talked about kind of some of the things that were found and were at least were disclosed over this past week. Now I want to shift gears and talk about the psychology of someone who would commit these kinds of offenses and somebody who would be interested in the kinds of, again, torture and rape and all kinds of fantasies that he was apparently searching for. One of the things as a forensic psychologist that is very difficult to do when you're evaluating a sexually violent individual is to get inside their head, because number one, they're often in a legal context when I evaluate them. Number two, even if they're not, even if they've been convicted, think about it. I mean, these individuals are aware that their sexual interests are not the norm and that most people would respond to some of these interests with disdain or disgust or anger or whatever. And so, even in a context where there's nothing legally at stake, they oftentimes aren't willing to disclose the fantasies that go on in their head. This treasure trove of searches, which really, I think, gives us a lot of information about the sexual fantasies that were driving him. Because why would you be searching for this kind of pornography if you weren't interested in it, if that wasn't a turn on to you? So why would somebody be interested? And what kind of diagnosis does that person have? The word sexual sadism has been thrown around a lot in this case. I think with good reason. I have never met Rex Heuermann. I've never evaluated him. So I'm basing what I'm saying on a couple of things, on the crimes that were committed and also the information that we have in terms of a search history and those kinds of things, which certainly are consistent with somebody who has sexual sadism. Sexual sadism is a paraphilic disorder. So a paraphilia is a deviant sexual interest, meaning it is a sexual interest that in the general population is not considered to be, I guess, normal. Now, as you might imagine, that might vary from country to country and culture to culture, and it certainly has varied over time. As a matter of fact, sadly, at one point, homosexuality was considered to be a deviant sexual interest and even a paraphilic disorder at some point. So it's important to keep in mind that what is considered to be deviant can vary with time and across culture. When we're talking about a paraphilic disorder, so a paraphilia, again, is this kind of is a deviant, uncommon sexual interest. What turns an interest into a disorder is when the paraphilia either causes the person who has it a lot of distress. It's what we call ego dystonic. And you like that psychology term? Just meaning, I don't like that I have it. I don't know why we don't just say that. But anyway, it's either ego dystonic for that person. I'm upset that I have this sexual interest, but I can't get rid of it. Or it causes distress or impairment in others. And I don't mean distress or impairment like, well, I wish you didn't have this sexual interest because I'm not into it. I mean, it causes impairment as in you are hurting me, which I don't like, and you're getting off on that. So I want to make a clear distinction. So if somebody is in legal trouble because of their paraphilic interest, or it's illegal. So pedophilia is considered to be a pedophilic disorder. And of course, if somebody is acting out that interest, that is illegal. That is impairment from a psychological standpoint. And from a legal standpoint, it's a crime. Sexual sadism is considered to be a paraphilic disorder. Fortunately for all of us, it is relatively rare. It's about 1% of the population. Interestingly enough, when you look at rapists, for example, only about 10% of rapists will actually meet the criteria for sexual sadism or sexual sadism disorder, whereas up to 75% of sexually motivated serial killers will, which in some respects kind of makes sense, right? Because when you look at individuals who commit rape, there's a myriad, it's diverse. You can find all different kinds of motives, all different kinds of, different classifications or whatever. When you talk about sexual sadism and the person is literally basically letting us know that what turns me on, what is psychologically satisfying me is to dominate, humiliate, torture, create pain, and scare you to death. That's what turns me on. And so by definition, for somebody to have sexual sadism, they are engaging with a non-consenting person. So it's really always illegal. So I do think that the searches that we've seen, as well as the crimes that have been committed, are consistent with sexual sadism. Although, again, I cannot diagnose specifically Rex Heuermann. He has not been convicted of anything to date. So then the question becomes, well, why would somebody be interested in sexual sadism? I mean, why would somebody, or how could somebody be turned on by hurting other people? Well, it's interesting because let's talk about sadism without the sex first. So sadism, which is basically getting pleasure or, kind of getting a thrill at somebody else's misfortune, is actually a personality trait. And if you look at the population in every country, but we're talking about the US, it's kind of on a bell curve, like a lot of personality traits are. So you have people who are just extremely, extremely low in terms, they not only do they not get any pleasure out of misfortune of other people, it causes them a lot of pain. And they're at this end. Then you have people like most of us who might get a little thrill if somebody we don't like, gets dressed down at work, or they don't do well on a project or whatever. Not something that we're proud of, but most of us have had those thoughts or those feelings before. And then you have somebody over here, and this again has nothing to do with sex, who really does kind of enjoy kind of tormenting other people. Maybe they'll gossip about somebody, or maybe they'll pit one person against the other. Or if they see two people getting into a fight, they kind of like that. They just kind of like seeing other people be unhappy or be hurt in some way. And so this personality trait is something we find in the general population on a bell curve. That certainly is not the case when we're talking about sexual sadism. We're not really sure about the overlap. So somebody can just kind of be somebody who has what I call everyday sadism. It doesn't spill over into their sex life. If it does, then this person maybe is interested in BDSM and they find a consenting partner and they work all that out. So they're very, very different from each other, which I think is very, very important to kind of bring up. So there's the sadism part. Sexual sadism, though, as I mentioned, is scary, especially when it is in combination with certain other personality traits. So there have been a lot of attempts, research attempts, and, to kind of figure out, where does this start? Does it start when there's a child, as an infant? And is there a biological component to it? And why in the world would somebody kind of get sex and violence kind of completely fused together? And we don't know the answer to that completely, but there have been some interesting studies that have come out relatively recently. One in particular that came out this year, which is very new, and it was basically trying to look at this put together a puzzle of what could lead to sexual sadism. And the theory kind of went something like this, that for whatever reason, there's some trauma that happens in childhood. And this trauma kind of interferes with this person as they're growing up, developing some effective coping skills. And then this person hits puberty, oftentimes because of some of the childhood trauma and this inability to resolve it, they will start engaging in fantasy. And fantasy can be a very powerful coping mechanism. It's interesting when you talk to people about how much they've used fantasy. I was more of a kind of distract myself from things when things were hurtful or whatever. I was somebody who'd get out and do something. But my husband is interesting. He would talk about when he was growing up and he had some, it was tough for him at times. He would talk about the fact that he would literally daydream all day long and he would create these stories in his head and those kinds of things. And it's interesting to see what a powerful coping mechanism that can be. So you have this trauma that starts early on. Then, in early adolescence or even pre-adolescence, this person, has some kind of negative adolescent experience. Oftentimes they're bullied, they're mistreated, they're depressed. And at the same time, you have all these hormones that are kind of stirring up or whatever. And and this person is maybe beginning to look at pornography or, interested in girls or interested in guys, whatever that person's sexual orientation is. And yet you have this person who's experiencing a lot of pain at the same time. And somehow, we don't know exactly how, but this person's anger over this mistreatment, anger over being unhappy or whatever. And somehow this person's sexuality, which is interesting because in addition to this kind of normal hormone that's washed over all of us and, just makes us, start exploring sexuality a lot, either in our minds or on the computer or in person, there seems to be a compulsive part to the sexuality that starts for individuals who become sexual sadists later on. Meaning, because we talk about there's this term that I came across in the research called hypersexuality in adolescence. And of course, I was thinking, what do you mean? I mean, you think about adolescents just being so sexual, right? In terms of just their hormones and everything. I mean, how do you define that? And what I realized is that it's not this person is masturbating twice a day or there's any quantitative number. It's more of a compulsion. It's more like this person begins to use, masturbation or pornography or whatever as a coping strategy, and it becomes a compulsion. So the person can't get away from it. They can't stop doing it. So instead of learning how to, manage their distress in better ways, and instead of learning how to have more effective relationships, they're kind of engaging in this fantasy and somehow sex gets in there and there's all this anger and it kind of becomes this recipe for disaster in a way. Now, that's maybe 3 or 4 pieces in an 8-piece pie. So that's about as far as we've gotten with the research. But it makes sense in a way when you think about it. Now, when does it start? Well, the research suggests that sexual sadism starts by the end of adolescence or early adulthood. What we don't know is, okay, how do we predict whether somebody who has sexually sadistic fantasies is going to then act on them? And that's, I think, where some of these personality traits come in, because we also find that individuals who are low on empathy, high on pathological narcissism, somebody who is exploitive, manipulative, they feel entitled. And underneath all that, of course, is this incredible sense of like low self-worth and can't tolerate criticism, quick to anger, and those kinds of things. So these personality traits kind of get mixed in with these deviant sexual interests. And that is really the most dangerous scenario, because what they found, which is interesting, is when they found people who had these kind of deviant sexual interests who didn't act on them, or who had these interests in kind of a dominant role in sex and those kinds of things, were really into the BDSM community, they found that these individuals, some of the fantasies might be exactly the same, but they weren't going to act on them because they had these breaks. They had these internal breaks that would prevent them from hurting other people. They had empathy. They were able to understand what it would do to somebody. They didn't have any desire to really hurt somebody. So it's not so much, the research suggests at least, that some of the fantasies aren't as extreme or as dark or whatever. It's just that there are these internal, it's almost like a moral compass that seems to be lacking in individuals who are true sexual sadists. So that's really my understanding. I think our understanding as psychologists about this sexual sadism and how important it is, I think, to know that when we're talking about sexually motivated homicides, it's almost like it's a paraphilia plus some very, very negative and destructive personality traits that can kind of combine. And then maybe it's the stressors that then trigger or compel the person to go out at a specific time. Although I think that does vary, because I've talked to some individuals who would say, I'm always hunting. I'm always looking for somebody else. It may not happen. I may not do it, but I'm always on that hunt. And that's that kind of compulsive part of it, I think. So I would love to hear your thoughts about my thoughts about what might be behind someone who would commit sexually motivated murder or sexually sadistic murders. Also, love for you to subscribe if you enjoyed this content. I'd love for you to suggest information or cases that you would think would be fun to cover. And I will talk to you soon. In the meantime, take care, stay safe, and come back soon when we unmask another murder.